The dust, kicked up by Marcus Kane's black stallion, settled like a shroud over Main Street as he dismounted outside the saloon. Children scattered like frightened sparrows, their mothers pulling them close behind curtained windows. The very air seemed to hold its breath when Marcus Savage Kane rode into town. His reputation preceded him like the shadow of death itself, a man who had sent more souls to their maker than the cholera outbreak of '78. Marcus tied his horse with practiced indifference, his weathered hands moving with the same deadly precision that had made him the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories. The silver spurs on his boots chimed a funeral dirge as he walked, each step echoing the finality of judgment. His dark eyes, cold as winter steel, surveyed the street with the calculated gaze of a predator. At 35, he had lived more lifetimes of violence than most men could imagine in their darkest nightmares. The saloon doors swung open before he could push them, revealing Elena Vasquez, the only woman in redemption brave enough to meet his gaze without flinching. "Marcus?" She nodded, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken history. "Usual tables waiting." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that passed for courtesy in his limited vocabulary of human interaction. As he settled into the corner booth that gave him clear sightlines to both entrances, Marcus reflected on the cruel irony of this town's name. Redemption. What a joke. He'd been many things: killer, hunter, weapon. But redeemed, that was a luxury for men who still believed in salvation. The afternoon heat pressed against the saloon's windows like an unwelcome visitor when the commotion began outside. Horses whinnied in terror, hooves thundering against packed earth. Marcus's head snapped up, his hand instinctively moving to his Colt .45. Through the dusty glass, he watched a runaway wagon careening down Main Street, its team of horses spooked beyond reason. Then he saw her. A woman in a simple blue dress standing frozen in the wagon's path, her arms wrapped protectively around a small boy who had chased a ball into the street. Time crystallized into that single moment. Her wide eyes, the child's terrified face, the thundering hooves bearing down on them both. Marcus moved before conscious thought could intervene. He exploded through the saloon doors, his body hitting the street in a dead run. The woman's scream pierced the air as he reached them, his powerful arms scooping up both the child and the woman, rolling them all clear as the wagon thundered past, missing them by mere inches. For a heartbeat, they lay tangled in the dust, breathing hard. The woman's hair had come loose from its proper bun, golden strands catching the afternoon light. When she looked up at him, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. A sensation so foreign it took him a moment to recognize it as surprise. She wasn't afraid. Those clear blue eyes held no terror, no revulsion, only gratitude and something else he couldn't name. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft as morning prayer. "You saved us both." The child, no more than 5, clung to her skirts, his eyes wide with the innocent awe children reserved for heroes in storybooks. Marcus stood quickly, extending his hand to help her up. When her fingers touched his, he felt the tremor that ran through her, not from fear, but from something else entirely. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You hurt?" She shook her head, brushing dust from her dress with trembling hands. "I'm fine. We're both fine, thanks to you." She straightened, and Marcus found himself struck by her composure. Most women would have been hysterical, but she seemed to gather strength from some inner well he couldn't fathom. "Sarah Turner," she said, extending her hand properly. "The new schoolteacher." "Marcus Kane," he replied, taking her hand briefly. He didn't mention the nickname that followed him like a curse. Something about her made him want to be just Marcus, at least for this moment. "Well, Mr. Kane," she said, her smile transforming her entire face, "I believe Providence placed you exactly where you needed to be today." She scooped up the child, who had retrieved his ball and was now staring at Marcus with unbridled fascination. As she walked away, Marcus stood rooted to the spot, watching her retreating figure. For the first time in 23 years, someone had looked at him and seen not a monster, but a man, The feeling was both terrifying and intoxicating. Behind him, the saloon doors creaked open. "Well, I'll be damned." Elena's voice carried a note of amazement. "Marcus Kane playing hero. Never thought I'd see the day." Marcus turned, his expression already hardening back into its familiar mask. But as he walked back into the saloon, he couldn't shake the memory of blue eyes that had looked at him without fear, or the way his name had sounded when she'd spoken it, like a prayer instead of a curse. 3 days had passed since the incident on Main Street, and Marcus found himself riding past the schoolhouse with an frequency that would have embarrassed him if he'd allowed himself to feel embarrassment. The one-room building sat on the edge of town, like a beacon of civilization in the wilderness, its whitewashed walls and red roof, a stark contrast to the weathered grey of most structures in Redemption. Through the open windows, he could hear Sarah Turner's voice, melodic and patient as she guided her students through their lessons. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her moving between the desks, her blue dress a flutter of color against the austere interior. She had a way of making even the most restless child sit still and listen, her presence commanding respect without demanding fear. "You're making a fool of yourself," Sheriff Tom Bradley said, approaching on horseback. Tom was one of the few men in town who remembered Marcus before the legend, back when they were both just boys trying to survive in a world that had shown them no mercy. "Don't know what you mean," Marcus replied, not taking his eyes off the schoolhouse. "Hell you don't." Tom reined in his horse beside Marcus's stallion. "Half the town's talking about how you've been circling this place like a lovesick coyote. The other half's betting on when you'll finally work up the courage to actually talk to her." Marcus's jaw tightened. "People talk too much in this town." "Maybe, but they're not wrong about this." Tom's voice softened. "Marcus, that woman's got more breeding in her little finger than most folks in this territory have in their whole bodies. She's educated, refined, probably comes from money back east. What makes you think she'd want anything to do with a man like you?" The question hit harder than Marcus wanted to admit. He'd been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, and the answer always came back the same. She wouldn't, shouldn't. But the memory of her hand in his, the way she'd said his name without a trace of fear, haunted him like a ghost he couldn't lay to rest. "I'm not thinking anything," Marcus said finally, "just making sure the schoolmom stays safe. Part of keeping peace in this town." Tom snorted. "If you say so. But Marcus, be careful. Her father's the new preacher, and he's already been asking questions about you. The man's got connections back east, and he's not the type to sit quiet if he thinks his daughter's in danger." Before Marcus could respond, the schoolhouse door opened and Sarah emerged, ringing the bell that dismissed her students for the day. Children poured out like water through a broken dam, their laughter and shouts filling the air with the kind of joy Marcus had almost forgotten existed. Sarah spotted him immediately, her face lighting up with a smile that made his chest tighten. She walked over, her steps confident despite the curious stares of the departing children. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth it had 3 days ago. "How nice to see you again." Tom tipped his hat. "Ma'am, I'll leave you two to talk." He shot Marcus a warning look before riding away. "I wanted to thank you again," Sarah continued, seemingly oblivious to the awkwardness of the situation. "Little Tommy's mother brought me a pie yesterday, just because you saved her boy. Acts of kindness have a way of rippling outward, don't they?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Was nothing. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't have. Not everyone has the courage to act when it matters most." She paused, studying his face with those unsettling blue eyes. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I was just about to make some, and I find I'm curious about the man who moves faster than lightning when children are in danger." Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to ride away and never look back. This woman was dangerous in ways no gunslinger had ever been. She threatened something far more precious than his life. She threatened the carefully constructed walls around his heart. "I don't think that would be appropriate, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah tilted her head, considering. "Mr. Kane, do you believe in second chances?" The question caught him off guard. "I believe in what I can see and touch." "Then perhaps," she said with a smile that seemed to see straight through his defenses, "you'll allow me to show you something worth believing in." Before he could respond, she was walking back toward the schoolhouse, leaving him sitting there wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, or if maybe, just maybe, he was about to discover what redemption actually meant. 2 weeks had passed since that first cup of coffee, and Marcus found himself living a double life he'd never imagined possible. By day, he was still the feared gunslinger who could silence a saloon with his presence. But in the quiet moments after school, when Sarah would invite him in for coffee and conversation, he discovered pieces of himself he'd thought were buried forever. She had a way of drawing stories from him without seeming to try. Small things at first, memories of his childhood before the darkness, observations about the changing seasons, even his thoughts on the book she'd been trying to get him to read. Marcus, who had barely spoken more than necessary for years, found himself talking to Sarah Turner like words were water and he'd been dying of thirst. "You're different when you're with her," Tom observed one evening as they sat on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "More like the boy I used to know." Marcus took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling up into the evening air. "People change, Tom. You know that better than anyone." "Some people change," Tom corrected. "Others just get better at hiding who they really are. The question is, which one are you?" Before Marcus could answer, the sound of raised voices drifted from the direction of the church. Both men stood, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. The argument was heated, punctuated by the deep baritone of Reverend James Turner and another voice Marcus didn't recognize. "That's Sarah's father," Tom said, his expression grim. "And unless I'm mistaken, that's Henry Blackwood with him." Marcus's blood ran cold. Henry Blackwood was a wealthy rancher from Austin, the kind of man who bought respectability with gold and expected the world to bend to his will. More importantly, he was the kind of man who would be considered a suitable match for a preacher's daughter. They approached the church cautiously, the argument becoming clearer with each step. Through the open door, Marcus could see Sarah standing between her father and a tall, well-dressed man with silver hair and a perfectly waxed mustache. "Sarah, be reasonable," Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Your father has already given his blessing. A woman of your education and refinement deserves better than teaching in this God-forsaken place." "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Blackwood," Sarah replied, her voice steady but strained. "But I'm quite content with my life here." "Content?" Reverend Turner's voice cracked like a whip. "Content associating with killers and degenerates? Sarah, I've heard the rumors about you and that monster Kane. Please tell me there's no truth to them." Marcus felt something die inside his chest. Monster. The word hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of exactly what he was and what he could never be. "Marcus Kane saved my life," Sarah said firmly. "He's a good man who's been judged unfairly." "Good man." Blackwood laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "My dear, the man has killed more people than the cholera. He's a savage, pure and simple. No amount of charm or pretty words can change that. You will not speak of him that way." Sarah's voice carried a steel Marcus had never heard before. "Sarah!" her father's voice thundered through the church. "You will accept Mr. Blackwood's proposal and return to Austin with him tomorrow. I will not have my daughter throwing her life away on a murderer." Marcus turned away, unable to listen to more. Tom caught his arm, but Marcus shrugged him off, walking back into the gathering darkness. Behind him, he could hear Sarah's voice rising in protest, but it seemed to come from very far away. She would go. Of course she would go. What choice did she have? A respected rancher offering marriage and security, or a gunslinger whose hands were stained with blood and whose soul was as black as the Texas night? The choice was obvious, even if it felt like dying. Marcus mounted his horse and rode hard toward the outskirts of town, trying to outrun the voice in his head that whispered what he'd known all along. Monsters didn't get happy endings. They got what they deserved, and what he deserved was the loneliness he'd carried for 23 years. But as he rode, He couldn't shake the memory of Sarah's voice defending him, calling him a good man when no one else in the world would have used those words. Maybe that would have to be enough. Maybe that small moment of grace was all the redemption a man like him could ever hope for. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Marcus heard the thunder of approaching horses. He'd been sitting on his porch, nursing black coffee and the kind of thoughts that kept a man awake all night when the dust cloud appeared on the eastern road. 5 riders, moving with the purposeful gait of men who carried bad news and worse intentions. Marcus recognized the leader before the group had even reached the town limits. Jackson Murdoch sat his horse like death incarnate, his coal-black duster billowing behind him in the desert wind. 20 years had passed since their last encounter, but Marcus would have known that scarred face and those cold grey eyes anywhere. The man who had sworn to paint the desert red with Marcus's blood had finally come to collect. Well, Murdoch called out as his gang reined in their horses 50 yards from Marcus's cabin. If it isn't the famous savage Kane, though I hear you've gone soft, playing house with some preacher's daughter. Marcus stood slowly, his hand resting casually near his holster. The morning ritual of coffee and contemplation was over. Now came the familiar dance of death he'd performed so many times before. Murdoch, figured you'd crawl out from whatever rock you've been hiding under eventually. Hiding? Murdoch's laugh was like broken glass scraping against stone. I've been building, Marcus, building an empire while you've been playing pretend in this pathetic excuse for a town. He gestured toward redemption with theatrical contempt. But I promised my baby brother I'd settle accounts before I moved on to bigger things. The mention of Danny Murdoch brought memories flooding back. Memories Marcus had spent years trying to bury. The job in Amarillo, the family caught in the crossfire, the way Danny's eyes had looked when Marcus's bullet found its mark. Some ghosts never stayed buried, no matter how deep you dug their graves. That was business, Jackson. Your brother knew the risks when he chose his path. Business? Murdoch's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. You killed him in front of his wife and children. You destroyed an innocent family for blood money, and you call it business? The words hit Marcus like physical blows because they carried the weight of truth. He remembered the woman's screams, the children's tears, the way the whole thing had gone wrong so fast. It was the job that had finally broken something inside him, the one that had made him realize he'd become exactly what everyone said he was. A monster. I remember, Marcus said quietly. I remember all of it. Good. Murdoch smiled, the expression transforming his face into something inhuman. Because I want you to remember everything when I put you in the ground. But first, I think I'll pay a visit to your lady friend. I hear she's quite the beauty. The threat hit Marcus like lightning, galvanizing every muscle in his body. You leave her out of this, Jackson. Your quarrel is with me. Oh, but she's part of this now, isn't she? Murdoch's smile widened. The great savage Kane, tamed by a schoolmarm. It's almost poetic. I think I'll make sure she watches when I kill you. Give her a good long look at what her hero really is when the chips are down. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of wheels on gravel announced the approach of a buckboard. Sarah sat straight-backed on the driver's seat, her face pale but determined. She'd clearly been crying, but her chin was set in a way Marcus had come to recognize as her most stubborn expression. She climbed down from the buckboard with careful dignity, ignoring the 5 armed men who watched her with predatory interest. Mr. Kane, she said formally, I need to speak with you. Ma'am. Murdoch tipped his hat with mock courtesy. I'm afraid Mr. Kane is indisposed at the moment. We're just renewing an old acquaintance. Sarah looked at Murdoch with the same expression she might reserve for something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. I wasn't speaking to you, sir. Marcus, we need to talk. Now. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. She was here, putting herself in danger when she should have been halfway to Austin with her respectable rancher. Sarah, you need to leave. Right now. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. Not with you. Not with Mr. Blackwood, and certainly not while these Gentlemen are threatening you." Murdoch's laugh echoed across the desert like the howl of a coyote. "Oh, this is rich. The little lady wants to play savior. Tell me, sweetheart, do you know what your boyfriend did to my family? Do you know how many innocent people he's killed?" Sarah turned to face Murdoch fully, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the look of a woman who had made peace with whatever was coming next. "I know exactly who Marcus Kane is," she said quietly. "The question is, do you know who I am?" The sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the dusty ground as the confrontation reached its inevitable crescendo. Marcus could feel the familiar coldness settling over him, the same detachment that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. But Sarah's presence changed everything, adding a terrible weight to every breath, every heartbeat. "You should have stayed away," Marcus said to Sarah, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "This isn't your fight." "Anything that threatens you is my fight," she replied, her blue eyes never leaving his face. "I made my choice last night, Marcus. I chose you over safety, over respectability, over everything my father wanted for me. I'm not running now." Murdoch spat into the dust, his patience clearly wearing thin. How touching. The killer and his saint, but playtime's over, Kane. High noon, Main Street, just like the old days. You and me, and may the fastest man live to tell the tale. "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked, though they all knew he wouldn't. "Then I'll kill everyone in this god-forsaken town one by one until you change your mind. Starting with the pretty schoolteacher." Murdoch's hand rested casually on his gun butt, the threat as real as the desert heat. Sarah stepped closer to Marcus, her hand finding his arm. "You don't have to do this. We could leave together right now. Start over somewhere else." Marcus looked down at her, memorizing every detail of her face. The slight upturn of her nose, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the stubborn set of her jaw that had first captured his attention. "Sarah, there are some debts that follow a man no matter how far he runs. This is one of them." "Then I'll stay and watch," she said simply. "Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." "No." Marcus's voice carried a finality that made her step back. "You'll go to the church and stay there until this is finished. That's not a request." The town began to empty as word spread of the impending duel. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows, mothers pulled children inside, and the brave souls who wanted to witness history in the making gathered at safe distances. Marcus had been in dozens of gunfights, but none had ever felt like this. None had ever mattered quite so much. At precisely noon, Marcus walked down Main Street toward the center of town. His boots echoed off the wooden sidewalks with the rhythm of a funeral march. Behind him, he could feel Sarah's eyes watching from the church window, and the weight of her gaze was almost unbearable. Murdoch was already waiting, standing in the middle of the street with his legs spread wide and his hand hovering over his holster. The years had been kind to him. He looked every bit as dangerous as Marcus remembered, maybe more so. "I've been waiting 20 years for this moment," Murdoch called out as Marcus approached. 20 years of dreaming about putting you in the ground." "Then let's get it over with," Marcus replied, taking his position 30 paces away. The silence that fell over redemption was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the two men faced each other across the dusty street. Marcus felt time slow to a crawl, his senses sharpening until he could hear his own heartbeat, feel the sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill that had settled in his bones. "You know what the funny thing is, Kane?" Murdoch's voice carried clearly in the stillness. "I almost feel sorry for you. You actually thought you could change, didn't you? Thought love could wash the blood off your hands?" Marcus didn't answer. Words were useless now. There was only the ancient ritual of violence, the dance he'd performed so many times it was carved into his very soul. "But here's the truth," Murdoch continued, his smile cruel and cold. "Men like us don't get redemption. We don't get happy endings. We get what we deserve, and what you deserve is a bullet and a shallow grave." Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll the hour. Marcus closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, thinking of Sarah's smile. The way she'd said his name like it was something precious. Then his eyes snapped open and his hand moved toward his gun. The street exploded into violence and sound. 2 shots fired so close together they seemed like one. Smoke filled the air as both men stood frozen, and for a moment that lasted an eternity. The outcome hung in the balance like a prayer waiting to be answered. The smoke cleared like a curtain being drawn back on the final act of a long and bloody play. Marcus stood upright, his smoking gun still in his hand, while Jackson Murdoch swayed on his feet, crimson spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. For a heartbeat, neither man moved, suspended in that terrible moment between life and death. Then Murdoch fell, his knees hitting the dust before his body followed, face first into the street that had seen too much violence. His gun lay 3 feet away, unfired, the metal gleaming in the afternoon sun like an accusation. Marcus holstered his weapon slowly, his hands surprisingly steady. He'd won, but victory felt like ashes in his mouth, another body on his conscience, another ghost to haunt his dreams. The familiar coldness that had protected him through countless fights was already seeping back into his bones, freezing out the warmth Sarah had kindled there. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice cut through the silence like salvation itself. She was running toward him, her skirts flying, tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, are you hurt?" He caught her as she threw herself into his arms, her body trembling against his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to hold her, to breathe in the scent of her hair and feel her heart beating against his. But the weight of what he'd just done pressed down on him like a physical thing. "I'm fine," he said, gently disentangling himself from her embrace. "But this doesn't change anything, Sarah. It never could." "What do you mean?" She searched his face, confusion replacing relief in her blue eyes. Marcus gestured toward Murdoch's body, where Tom Bradley was already kneeling to check for signs of life. "Look at me, really look. This is who I am. This is what I do. I solve problems with bullets and leave bodies in my wake." His voice was hollow, empty of the warmth she'd grown accustomed to. "You deserve better than a killer." "Stop it." Sarah's voice carried a strength that surprised them both. "Stop trying to push me away because you're afraid. I've seen who you really are, Marcus Kane. I've seen the man who saves children, who reads poetry when he thinks no one is watching, who treats an old horse with more gentleness than most men show their families. But I'm also the man who just put a bullet in another human being," Marcus replied. "The man whose past is written in blood." Sarah stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "Yes, you are. You're both men, Marcus. The question is, which one are you going to choose to be from now on?" Around them, the town of Redemption slowly came back to life. People emerged from buildings, children peeked around corners, and life resumed its normal rhythm. But something fundamental had changed in that dusty street, something that went beyond the death of Jackson Murdoch. "Marry me," Sarah said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Not because it's proper or safe or what anyone expects. Marry me because I love the man you're becoming, and I want to stand beside you while you become him." Marcus stared at her, this impossible woman who saw light where everyone else saw only darkness. "Sarah, Don't give me reasons why we can't," she interrupted. "Give me one reason why we shouldn't try." Marcus looked around at the town that had given him his second chance, at the people who were slowly learning to see him as something other than a monster. He thought about the coffee cups and quiet conversations, the books she'd shared with him, the way she'd said his name like it was something precious. "I can't promise I'll ever be the man you deserve," he said finally. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her entire face with joy. "I'm not asking for perfection, Marcus. I'm asking for forever." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus Kane made the most important decision of his life. He chose love over fear, hope over despair, and the uncertain promise of redemption over the familiar embrace of solitude. "Then yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you, Sarah Turner, and God help me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the faith you've placed in me." In the distance, the church bell began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayer and announcing to all of redemption that sometimes miracles do happen in the most unlikely places.